he's made people think the unthinkable about the threat of a major European war, which the United Kingdom could well be involved in, an existential threat to the United Kingdom. That's what he's made us think about over the last 24 hours.
The head of the army has said that tens of thousands of civilians must be trained and equipped to form a citizens' army in case Britain's dragged into war with a country such as Russia. General Sir Patrick Sanders, Chief of the General Staff, also publicly criticised the army's lack of funding and its failure to modernise. He's due to leave his post within 6 months, and The Times has reported that he's annoyed Rishi Sunak by criticising the decision to reduce the size of the army to 73,000 by the middle of the decade. Well, in a speech earlier, General Sanders said that within 3 years there should be a larger army of 120,000, including regular soldiers, reserves and a strategic reserve. And The Times in the morning hears that some senior military figures are discussing building a force of up to 500,000. Well, let's talk to Charlie Herbert, who's a former British Army commander. He was in Afghanistan. He's also a former senior NATO advisor to the Afghan Ministry of the Interior. Good evening to you, Charlie.
Carol, good evening. Thank you for inviting me on.
Well, great to have you with us. What do you make of General Sir Patrick Sanders, who is in post as the Chief of the General Staff, calling essentially for lots more civilians to sign up?
I mean, General Patrick's definitely somebody to listen to, Carol. He's a hugely experienced, hugely capable army officer. Vast experience in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and indeed in Whitehall. He has a reputation for speaking his mind. He's going to hand over that job and complete his service in about 6 months' time. So now's the time for him to sort of feel slightly unshackled by political constraints and say what he wants to. I think what he's done here, Carol, is he's to provoke. That's exactly what he's done. He's gone onto the front pages. He's provoking debate about the army budget and whether the army gets the right slice of the defence budget. I think he's provoking debate about whether the defence budget is large enough in these times. But I think most importantly, what he's done is he's made people think the unthinkable about the threat of a major European war, which the United Kingdom could well be involved in, an existential threat to the United Kingdom. That's what he's made us think about over the last 24 hours. Yeah, and that's not a bad idea in my view. If he'd done this 10 years ago, I would have said he was deranged. But of course, almost exactly 10 years ago, Russia annexed Crimea. Almost exactly 2 years ago, Russia launched a state-on-state major invasion of the Ukraine. And this notion of state-on-state conflict in Europe in the 21st century, which seemed inconceivable a few years ago, now looks really quite possible.
Charlie, there's so much to discuss in all of this. I mean, he does seem to be challenging so much of the thinking that has shaped our military strategy and those strategic reviews, when it's all been about moving towards new technology, cyber, and of course, of Britain working alongside a coalition of forces, notably the United States. Now, first of all, do you think it is because what we've seen in Ukraine is much closer to conventional warfare, even though we have seen, of course, the use of things like drones?
It's exactly right, Carol. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, British Army's been involved for 20 years in relatively low intensity campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. What we're seeing in Ukraine is a type of warfare that we, to a certain extent, stopped thinking about training for and equipping ourselves for at the end of the Cold War. Now, what we're seeing in Ukraine is high intensity major combat operations. And that's exactly what General Patrick seeks to reset the army for. I mean, we've got about 200 tanks in the British Army. Now, the army is smaller than it's ever been for, I think, 200 years, 73,000 soldiers. I mean, it is tiny. What General Patrick's doing, and he's not alone in this, other chiefs of the General Staff before him have made this point, that we've got to be in a position where we can rapidly enlarge the army, grow it very, very quickly, should it be needed to do so in the future.
But when we look at a situation where we're struggling to recruit people to the existing posts, and it is proving difficult to encourage a lot of younger people to sign up, do you think you're really going to get sufficient numbers of civilians who are prepared to consider taking on military life?
Yeah, Carl, that's an absolutely brilliant point. I mean, General Patrick said that recruitment figures, those expressing an interest in the army, are higher now than they've ever been for 6 years. But there's no doubt that the armed forces in general are struggling to recruit. There is no doubt about that. That's fact. Um, and if we wish to grow the size of the army from 73,000 to 90,000 or 120,000, as General Patrick said, then they've got to change the offer. The offer's got to be more attractive to today's youngster. It's got to change, the standard of infrastructure, housing, accommodation, all of these things. The army needs to modernize, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of the offer which is providing to young men and women who wish to join at the moment. You're absolutely right. It
But if
has
we're
to
talking about needing them because of the prospect of some form of confrontation with Russia, is it realistic to think that sufficient numbers of people will be prepared to sign up as some form of reserve force? We do, of course, already have reservists who can be called upon, but they're struggling to recruit people as well.
Yeah, I mean they are. There's no doubt about it. It's not impossible. It's got to be the right offer, and it's got to be the right circumstances, and it's got to be sold correctly. And I think General Patrick's doing that. Only what 30 years ago, in the last century, 24 years ago, we had a territorial army of about 50,000. Some years before that, it was about 100,000. The notion of getting a volunteer army who is prepared to give up a certain amount of their time, it could only be a week per year, in order to provide some essential basic training so that they are available should there be times of national emergency. That notion is not impossible. And to a certain extent, what I think General Patrick is doing is he's just making people think about this, not just the politicians, but also the general public, and also the members of the armed forces.
And how much of this do you think is about the fact that so much of our strategic defence thinking has been about the fact that British forces would be acting alongside those of other countries, typically, of course, the United States, and we have seen that in the Red Sea. But there is the very real prospect of a second Donald Trump term in the White House. He would be an unpredictable partner, to say the least. How much do you think this is about senior military figures saying, well, maybe we won't be able to rely on the United States. We're not as closely engaged with European allies, and we may have to fight a war on our own?
I think you raised some really interesting questions there. Our force structures are optimized to play a part within NATO, a US-led NATO, integrating not just the United Nations, but it's the United States, but all the other sort of 20, 30 countries that make up NATO. You're absolutely right in questioning whether the United States in the future will wish to provide that backbone to NATO, and we saw signs of that when President Trump was lost in as president. And I think there are emerging ideas about Europe needing to play a greater part in the defence of Europe and not be entirely reliant on the United Kingdom. I mean, the UK is not going to do this alone. The UK is going to have to do this with partners and with alliances, and that would include both the European Union, but also, the overarching one, NATO. That won't go away. NATO will not go away anytime soon. But you raise a very, very good question about what would happen if the United States, was to disengage more from Europe in order to pivot to the Asia Pacific, which is what it's been talking about for the last decade.
Charlie Herbert, former British Army commander in Afghanistan, former senior NATO advisor to the Afghan Ministry of Interior. Really good to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Carl.